Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that changed everything? A little girl gave her only birthday cake to a grieving millionaire, unaware she was about to transform his life forever. Ryan Harper never intended to sit alone on that park bench in the middle of Manhattan with a paper party hat balanced on his head and a small white box resting on his knees. He had planned to spend the day, as he had every year since the accident, in his office behind closed doors, burying himself in reports and spreadsheets until the date passed and the ache dulled. But when the morning came, he had found himself unable to walk through those glass doors. Instead, he kept going, letting the car take him downtown until he was standing here in the little park that had once been his daughter's favorite place. The air felt almost too clean, as if the chill breeze were determined to remind him he was still alive while she was not. He sat with his hands folded around the box and tried to pretend he was simply another stranger passing time. Can you imagine the weight of such a memory? Inside the box was a single pastry, a small vanilla cake with white icing. He hadn't planned to buy it. He'd seen it through the bakery window, and for one moment, he could almost hear Lily's delighted voice as she pressed her hands to the glass, insisting that birthdays weren't birthdays without cake, even if it was just the three of them. The memory had been so vivid, he walked inside and asked for the smallest cake they had. Now he couldn't bring himself to open the box, to light the candle he carried in his pocket, to admit out loud why he was really here. 5 years. It felt impossible that so much time had passed since the accident took Lily and her mother away from him. He could still see their faces in every quiet corner of his memory. No matter how much he tried to build walls around the grief, it always found a way to slip back into the light. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the memory wash over him because sometimes it was easier to feel everything than to feel nothing. He remembered Lily's birthday the year before the accident, the way she had danced around the kitchen in her new red dress, her curls bouncing with every step. He remembered his wife's tired smile as she lit the candles, her hands slipping into his as they watched their daughter make her wish. Back then, he had believed he was a good man, a good father. Back then, he thought there would be so many more birthdays. When he finally opened his eyes, he realized that several people had passed without sparing him a glance. That was how the city worked. It was possible to break apart in public, and no one would ever stop to ask why. He supposed that was why he came here every year, to be both visible and invisible, to hold his grief where it could breathe instead of letting it suffocate him behind office walls. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there staring at nothing when he felt a small shadow fall across his lap. He looked up, startled, and saw a little girl standing in front of him, her blue eyes wide and curious. She couldn't have been more than 6, and something about the way she clutched a small cake in her hands made his heart stutter. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice, struck by the impossible resemblance between her and the child he had lost. The girl didn't seem afraid of him or uncertain. She simply tilted her head, studying him with the quiet patience only children seem to possess. Then, in a voice that was clear and earnest, she said, "Sir, happy birthday. Why are you all alone?" The question felt like it cracked something inside him open, something he had spent 5 years trying to keep closed. And though he knew he should look away or send her back to wherever she had come from, he found that he couldn't. He simply looked back at her and felt the strangest sense that life had just shifted in a way he could not yet understand. The little girl stood so still in front of him that Ryan wondered if she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. She wore a red dress with a little white collar and a denim jacket several sizes too big for her narrow shoulders. Her blonde hair was tied in 2 uneven ponytails with blue ribbons, and the cake she held looked like it had come from the same bakery where he'd bought his own. She clutched it carefully against her chest, as if she were afraid it might slip from her grasp if she breathed too hard. Her eyes were bright with a solemn curiosity that seemed too old for someone so small, and he felt a pang of guilt that he couldn't immediately answer her question. He cleared his throat, trying to find the words that wouldn't frighten her or reveal too much of the truth he carried like a stone in his chest. "I'm just remembering someone very special," he said at last, his voice softer than it had been in years. Today would have been her birthday. The girl nodded as if she understood perfectly, though he doubted she really could. She took a tiny step closer and looked down at the white box in his lap. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing something in her mind, the way a child does when they are about to do something that feels bigger than they are. Then, with a determined little breath, she lifted her cake toward him. "You can have mine," she said. "It's not good to be alone on a birthday." Her words struck him so unexpectedly that he couldn't answer at first. His throat felt tight, and the sunlight seemed too bright around the edges of his vision. He had spent so many years surrounded by people who never said anything so simple or so honest that it took him a moment to remember how to respond. He set his own box carefully beside him and reached out to steady hers, afraid she would drop it. "That's very kind of you," he managed after a moment. "But you should keep it. It looks delicious." The girl shook her head firmly. "I bought it with my own money," she explained with the same gravity she might have used to announce the sky was blue. "I wanted to give it to someone who needed it. Mama says birthdays are for sharing." Something behind his ribs gave a slow, painful twist. He wondered what kind of life had taught her to notice loneliness in a stranger's face. He looked at the little cake, just a simple vanilla round with a single pink candle, and felt something in himself start to thaw, like ice breaking under warm rain. "What's your name?" he asked, because it felt important to know. "Emma," she said promptly, hugging the cake closer for a moment before holding it out to him again. "And my mama's name is Sarah. She works over there." She turned her head and gestured to a small diner across the street with a faded blue awning. He followed her gaze, taking in the old-fashioned sign and the worn linoleum visible through the big front windows. He tried to picture Sarah inside wiping tables or filling coffee cups, completely unaware that her daughter was out here offering cakes to strangers in suits. He hesitated, unsure what the right thing to do was. Every instinct he had was to protect this child from the rough edges of the world, to tell her to keep her cake and go straight home. But he could see how important this was to her, how proud she felt to be able to offer him something when she thought he was sad. He didn't want to take that from her. Slowly, he reached out and covered her small hand with his. "Would you like to share it with me instead?" he asked. "We could have a little celebration together." Emma's face brightened in a way that made his heart lurch painfully. She nodded and sat down beside him without needing any further invitation, her legs swinging over the edge of the bench. She set the cake carefully on her lap while he opened his own white box and took out the small pastry he hadn't been able to eat alone. Together, they unwrapped the cakes and set them side by side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He found himself telling her in a quiet voice about his daughter, how she had once loved vanilla cake more than anything, how she'd always insisted on singing her own birthday song before blowing out the candles. Emma listened as if every word mattered. When he finished, she looked up at him with solemn blue eyes and said, "I think she would be happy you're not alone today." It was such a simple statement, but it undid him completely. He closed his eyes and felt a tear slide down his cheek. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel ashamed of it. When he opened his eyes again, Emma was still there, watching him with a quiet understanding that no adult had ever offered him. He realized, sitting on that bench with a stranger's child, that this was the closest he had come to peace in a very long time. Ryan had never been the kind of man who believed in signs or fate. But as he sat there on that worn wooden bench beside a little girl he'd met only minutes earlier, he felt something shift deep in his chest. The park around them blurred into a quiet backdrop of passing footsteps and drifting leaves, and all he could focus on was how calmly Emma unwrapped the cake as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world to share her treasure with a stranger in a suit. He watched her hands, small and careful, as she smoothed the crinkled paper around the cake's edge and set it squarely between them. Her concentration was so complete that he didn't dare interrupt her, afraid to shatter whatever fragile understanding had formed between them. When she was satisfied the cake was ready, she looked up and gave him an expectant nod, waiting for him to light the candle. He fumbled in his pocket, feeling strangely clumsy as he pulled out the little box of matches he had brought along without ever intending to use. His hands trembled more than he wanted to admit, and it took him 3 tries to strike a flame that didn't die in the wind. When the wick finally caught, and the candle glowed with a soft golden light, Emma folded her hands in her lap, her eyes wide and serious. "Do you want to make a wish first?" she asked, her voice so earnest it made his throat tighten. For a moment, he could almost hear Lily's voice layered over hers, the memory so vivid he had to look away. He had told himself he would never again believe in wishes, that nothing could bring back what he'd lost. But sitting here with this tiny stranger, he found he wanted to try. He took a long breath and closed his eyes, letting the flicker of the candle steady his heartbeat. He didn't wish for the impossible. Instead, he wished for something smaller and somehow braver, that this moment of kindness would be enough to remind him he was still human, still capable of feeling something other than regret. When he opened his eyes, Emma was waiting patiently, her hands still folded neatly. He nodded to her and she squeezed her eyes shut, her mouth moving silently as she made her own secret wish. A gust of wind tugged at her hair, and he watched as she leaned forward and blew out the candle in one soft breath. The tiny curl of smoke drifted up between them, and he felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest, a flicker of something that felt suspiciously like hope. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as the candle cooled and the last of the smoke vanished into the crisp air. Finally, Emma reached for the small plastic knife that had come with the cake and began to cut uneven pieces with the same careful concentration she'd shown before. She offered him the first slice without hesitation. He accepted it, surprised by how much it mattered that she wanted him to have it. He tasted the vanilla frosting and found it sweeter than anything he'd eaten in years. Maybe because for the first time, he wasn't eating it alone. Between bites, she started to tell him about herself in the unself-conscious way only children could. She explained that she was 6, that she liked dinosaurs and coloring books, and that her mama worked a lot, but always tucked her in at night. She told him her favorite color was yellow, and that she wished she had a pet rabbit. Ryan listened without interrupting, feeling something in him ease with every word. When she paused to take another bite, she turned those solemn blue eyes back to him. "What was your daughter's name?" she asked gently, as if she already knew it was something precious he rarely shared. "Lily," he whispered, the name tasting like both love and loss. "Her name was Lily." Emma repeated it softly under her breath as if she was promising not to forget. Then she looked up at him again, her gaze steady. "I think she would like that you're sharing cake with me." He felt his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. All he could do was nod. They finished the cake together in the fading afternoon light, and for a little while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe in this small and probable moment, something was being returned to him, something he hadn't even known he was still searching for. When the last crumbs of the cake were gone, Emma brushed her hands on the hem of her red dress with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who understood that even something as sweet as a shared celebration must end eventually. Ryan watched her in the golden spill of afternoon light, unable to shake the feeling that he was watching a scene from someone else's life, something softer and simpler than the cold routines that had defined his days for so long. She sat quietly beside him, swinging her feet against the bench as if she hadn't just dismantled years of silence and self-protection with her small, stubborn kindness. He tried to find something to say that would capture how much this hour had mattered. But the words felt too big for the air between them. Instead, he simply rested his hands on his knees and let the hush stretch out, grateful that she seemed content to sit without forcing conversation. After a while, Emma tilted her head, studying him with a thoughtful frown. "You look different now," she announced, her voice solemn but curious. "Not so sad." He blinked at her, surprised by how gently she had noticed what no one else ever dared to mention. He didn't have an easy answer, so he nodded and said, "I think that's because of you." She accepted this explanation without fanfare, as though it were the most natural thing in the world for her to bring comfort to a stranger. Then she looked down at her empty cake box and smoothed the crinkled edge with her thumb. "Do you want to meet my mama?" she asked suddenly. "She'll be happy I found someone to share with." The question caught him so completely off guard that he forgot how to breathe for a moment. He pictured Sarah as he had glimpsed her through the diner window, her tired face and flour-dusted apron, the way she had kept glancing at the door as if she expected Emma to come bursting through at any second. It struck him that Sarah must be worried sick by now, and a pang of guilt twisted through him that he had let so much time pass. But when he looked at Emma's hopeful face, he knew he couldn't turn her away. He nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's go see her." She slipped off the bench and held out her hand, her small fingers warm and certain in his own as he rose to follow. They walked side by side along the narrow path that curved around the playground and spilled out onto the sidewalk. The city moved around them in waves of noise and motion, horns blaring, people striding past without so much as a glance. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was only observing life from behind glass. He was in it, present. Every step he took felt like some small act of faith that maybe he was not beyond redemption. At the corner, Emma paused and looked up at the diner with an expression of mingled relief and hesitation. The awning fluttered in the breeze, and through the front window, he could see Sarah wiping down the counter with quick, anxious movements. Emma squeezed his hand once before letting go and pushing the door open. A bell chimed overhead, and Sarah's head snapped up instantly, her eyes widening as they landed on her daughter. For a split second, there was only the stunned recognition on her face, the palpable rush of relief that Emma was safe. But as her gaze moved past the little girl to where Ryan stood in the doorway, something else flickered there. Weariness, confusion, and a tired apprehension that made his heart twist. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of too many people who assumed his money made him untrustworthy. Emma didn't seem to notice. She ran across the checkered floor and threw her arms around her mother's waist, burying her face against the apron as if she had only just remembered how much she had missed her. Sarah knelt, cupping her daughter's face in both flour-dusted hands, checking her over with a frantic tenderness that made Ryan feel like an intruder in a moment too intimate to witness. "Emma, sweetheart, where have you been?" she asked, her voice thin with strain. "I was so worried." "I'm okay, Mama," Emma interrupted, her voice muffled in Sarah's apron. "I met a man who was sad. We shared my cake. It was his little girl's birthday." Sarah's gaze lifted to Ryan again, and he saw her putting the pieces together, his expensive suit, the way he hovered at the threshold like he didn't belong here, the guilt on his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. The diner felt too bright, too silent. Then Sarah rose, keeping her hands on Emma's shoulders, and faced him directly. "Thank you for bringing her back," she said, her voice cautious but not unkind. "I'm sure she meant well. She doesn't always understand." She trailed off and her eyes moved over him, searching for something. He took a steadying breath, feeling the old instinct to retreat into polite distance, but he made himself stay. He owed Emma that much. He owed her more than he could say. "I'm sorry," he began, feeling how inadequate the words were. "I should have brought her back sooner. She wanted to share her cake. I didn't have the heart to refuse." He hesitated, then added, "It helped me more than I can explain." Sarah's expression softened just enough to reveal the woman beneath the weariness, the mother who understood grief, even if she didn't know the details of his. She nodded slowly. "I'm glad she could help," she said simply. Emma beamed up at him as though she hadn't noticed the tension at all. "Mama, this is my friend Ryan," she announced with the same matter-of-fact pride she might have used to introduce a classmate. He didn't want to be alone. And standing there in the doorway, Ryan realized she was right. He hadn't wanted to be alone. Not today. Maybe not ever again. Sarah didn't invite him to sit right away. She was still standing protectively behind Emma, one hand resting on the little girl's shoulder, as though she needed to remind herself that her daughter was truly there and unharmed. Ryan understood the caution in her eyes. He imagined how it must have looked to her. A wealthy stranger in an expensive suit showing up with her child and an explanation that probably sounded too strange to trust. But he didn't blame her for any of it. He would have done the same if it had been Lily. He held her gaze and waited, giving her the space to decide what felt safe. Around them, the diner returned to its quiet rhythm. A waitress carried plates to the last occupied table. The cook flipped something on the grill behind the pass-through window and the scent of coffee and warm bread drifted through the air. It was the kind of place built on routine where regulars ordered the same thing every morning and no one expected surprises. He imagined that Sarah relied on that predictability, the comfort of knowing where every boundary was drawn. And here he was crossing all of them. Emma shifted her weight from foot to foot, glancing from her mother to Ryan and back again. At last, Sarah seemed to exhale whatever fear she'd been holding in her chest. She rested her palm lightly on Emma's hair and said, "Why don't you go sit in the booth by the window, sweetheart? I'll be there in a minute." Emma didn't protest or ask questions. She just nodded and walked to the far side of the diner, climbing into the red vinyl seat and pressing her palms to the glass to watch the people on the sidewalk. For a moment, the sight of her there, so small and so certain, made something in Ryan's heart twist painfully. He looked back at Sarah and tried to find the right words, but none of them felt adequate. "I'm sorry I kept her so long," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I promise nothing happened that you need to worry about. She just saw me sitting alone and she wanted to help. I didn't know how to tell her no. Sarah nodded, her expression still guarded, but he could see the edges of her suspicion softening. She has a good heart, she said after a moment, almost reluctantly. Sometimes it scares me how easily she wants to fix everything she sees. Ryan smiled faintly, feeling the weight of that truth. She reminds me of my daughter, he said, the words slipping out before he could decide whether he should share them. For a long second, Sarah didn't speak. She only studied him with that same searching look, as if she were trying to understand who he really was beneath the suit and the careful courtesy. Finally, she gestured to an empty booth across from Emma and said, if you'd like to sit, you can. I need to finish my shift, but we can talk after. He didn't let himself hesitate. He simply nodded and walked to the booth, sliding onto the seat opposite Emma, who greeted him with a bright, innocent smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. For the next half hour, he watched her draw pictures on the paper placemat with a stubby blue crayon she pulled from her pocket. She told him about her favorite cartoons, the way her mama made the best pancakes in the world, and how sometimes she wished she had someone to play board games with when her mama worked late. He answered her questions when she asked them, but mostly he let her talk. He realized how long it had been since he'd simply sat with a child and let their words fill the space without needing to redirect or rush. She didn't expect anything from him except that he be there. It was startling in its simplicity. Eventually, Sarah returned with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. She sat across from him, still wearing her apron, her hands folded tightly around her own cup. She looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much alone for too long. I don't mean to be rude, she began carefully, but I have to ask, what exactly happened today? Ryan didn't take offense. He'd been rehearsing this answer since he left the park. He told her everything. How he had been sitting there because it was his daughter's birthday. How he hadn't been able to make himself go back to his office. How Emma had appeared like something out of a dream and offered him her cake. He didn't embellish or soften any of it. He just spoke plainly, hoping she could hear that there was no hidden motive behind any of it. When he finished, Sarah didn't speak right away. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze measuring but not unkind. Then she looked over at Emma, who was now leaning her cheek against the window, her eyelids drooping with fatigue. She doesn't have a lot of people, Sarah said quietly. Neither do I. I work a lot of hours, and it's just the 2 of us. There was no accusation in her voice, just a tired resignation. Ryan nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. I don't either, he admitted. I lost them both in an accident. It's been a long time since I let anyone sit with me like that. For the first time, he saw something in Sarah's eyes that wasn't only caution, something almost like recognition, as if in the quiet spaces between their words, she had found something familiar. He didn't try to push it. He only sat there, feeling the weight of all he hadn't said, and realizing he didn't want to leave yet. Not today. Maybe not for a while. The diner had mostly emptied out by the time Sarah stood and quietly excused herself to finish closing the register. Ryan remained in the booth, feeling the way the late afternoon sunlight slanted across the checked floor and made the place look softer, almost tender in its ordinariness. He watched Emma, who had finally surrendered to her drowsiness and fallen asleep with her cheek pressed against the cool glass of the window. Her small hands still held the blue crayon, the tip smudged into the crease of the placemat where she'd been drawing a lopsided sun. Something about the picture made a tight ache bloom behind his ribs. He wondered if Lily would have been like this at 6, confident and kind, unafraid to approach a stranger because she believed that one simple gesture could fix what was broken. He didn't know if he envied Emma her innocence or simply marveled at it because it had been so long since he'd felt anything that uncomplicated. He let his gaze drift to Sarah, who was speaking in low tones with the other waitress as she counted the register drawer. Every so often, she glanced over at Emma, her expression softening despite the exhaustion that drew shadows under her eyes. He recognized something in that look, something he had once seen on his wife's face when she thought no one was watching. That fierce protective tenderness that made a person keep going no matter how empty they felt. He looked away, feeling suddenly like he was intruding on something private, but the realization stayed with him. He had spent so many years convincing himself he was better off alone, that it was safer never to let anyone close enough to leave him hollow if they disappeared. But as he sat here with a sleeping child and her mother, he began to understand that all he'd really done was trade one kind of pain for another. Solitude didn't protect him from grief. It only made it lonelier. He felt a soft stir of air as Sarah returned to the booth, setting her folded apron on the table before easing into the opposite seat. She looked tired enough that for a moment he almost offered to leave to spare her the effort of any more conversation, but when she met his gaze, he saw that she didn't want him to go just yet. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. He sipped the coffee she had brought him, aware that it had long since gone lukewarm, and waited for her to decide how much of herself she was willing to share. Finally, she sighed and rubbed a hand over her forehead. "She's always been like that," she said quietly, tilting her head toward Emma. "She can't stand seeing people sad. Even when she was a toddler, she'd bring me her toys if I looked upset, like she thought if she gave away enough pieces of herself, everything would be okay again." Her voice caught at the edges and she swallowed. "I worry sometimes that the world's going to teach her that's not how it works." Ryan considered this, feeling the weight of the truth in it. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but today she was right." It did help. He watched Sarah's shoulders ease a fraction as though she'd been bracing for judgment that didn't come. He understood that too well. How shame could wrap around even the simplest acts of love. How it made you second-guess the things that made you human. They fell quiet again. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because some feelings were too big for words. It was Emma who eventually shifted and murmured in her sleep, her lashes fluttering as she turned her face away from the window. Sarah reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. Her hand lingered there, gentle and protective, before she let it fall to the table. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it over the low murmur of the kitchen behind them. "For being kind to her, for not making her feel like she did something wrong." Ryan looked down at his hands, feeling an unexpected sting behind his eyes. "She reminded me of my little girl," he said, his voice rough, "and she reminded me what it's like to feel seen." He didn't elaborate further. He couldn't, but when he finally looked up, Sarah was watching him with something that looked almost like understanding. Not pity, not suspicion, just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who knew what it was to lose and keep living anyway. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the neon sign in the window flickering to life. Emma sighed in her sleep, her small hand twitching as though she were still offering something, even in her dreams. Ryan realized he didn't want to go back to his empty apartment. Not yet. Not when, for the first time in years, he felt as though he had stumbled into a place where it was safe to remember everything he had tried so hard to forget. And though he couldn't have explained why, he knew that this moment, this simple, quiet evening, was going to change everything that came after it. The following weeks unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability, as if something had clicked into place that neither of them fully understood, but neither tried to resist. Ryan had thought at first that the afternoon he spent in that diner would be a singular moment, an unusual collision of loneliness and kindness that would pass and be filed away as a memory too delicate to revisit. But the next morning, he found himself driving past the same diner again, unable to pretend he didn't want to look through the window and see Emma sitting there with her crayons or Sarah wiping down the counter. He parked across the street and sat for a long time, feeling foolish, trying to convince himself to keep driving, to go back to his real life. But when he finally stepped out of the car, it was as though his body already knew what his mind was too cautious to admit. He needed to see them again. Inside, the diner looked almost exactly the same as it had that first afternoon. The same old radio played a familiar tune. The same scent of coffee and pancake batter filled the air. Emma was sitting in the same booth by the window, her legs tucked under her as she drew on a napkin. When she spotted him, her face lit up in a way that made something warm and unsteady unfurl in his chest. She didn't hesitate before sliding out of the booth and coming straight to him, hugging him around the waist with a confidence that stunned him. He had no idea when he had last been greeted that way without pretense, without hesitation, by someone who simply wanted him there. Sarah came around the counter, and this time her face didn't look wary, only tired and a little surprised. She greeted him quietly, her eyes searching his for something he didn't know how to name. He felt a sudden urge to explain himself, to reassure her he wasn't some wealthy man looking for a novelty to soothe his own loneliness. But before he could speak, she just nodded and said, "She's been asking if you'd come back." He didn't stay long that first morning, only long enough to have a cup of coffee and listen to Emma chatter about her drawing of a rabbit with wings. But the next day, he came again and the next until it became something like a ritual. He started leaving the office early, ignoring the puzzled looks from his assistant and telling himself he could afford to step away from work for the first time in years. Each visit was a small act of defiance against the hollow routine that had defined his life since the accident. It felt strange to realize he was becoming part of their days, that they were slowly becoming part of his. He learned little details he had never asked about before. He learned that Sarah had been working double shifts since Emma was born because she had no one else to help. He learned that Emma's father had left before she could walk and never once sent a postcard or a dime. He learned that the blue denim jacket she wore every day had been patched 3 times on the elbows because Sarah refused to let her daughter feel like she had less than the other kids in her kindergarten class. He listened to all of it without judgment or pity, only the quiet ache of recognition in his chest that no amount of money could protect anyone from loss. There were evenings when he stayed until the diner closed. Sometimes Emma would fall asleep in the booth with her head pillowed on his folded coat, and Sarah would sit across from him, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug as she finally let her own guard down. They didn't always talk about their grief, but it was there in the spaces between words. In the way she would look out the window when she spoke about the future, as if she was afraid to imagine it, in the way he sometimes couldn't finish a sentence without feeling his voice threaten to break. And yet, the silences never felt uncomfortable. They felt necessary, like the slow, careful unspooling of a knot that had been tangled too long. One night, as he was carrying a sleeping Emma to the door, Sarah stepped forward to adjust the collar of the little girl's jacket. Her hand brushed his arm, and for the first time, he realized she was shaking a little. She met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. A fragile recognition that neither of them was ready to name, but both were starting to trust. He set Emma down gently on the threshold, and when he looked back, Sarah was still standing there, watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on anyone's face in years. It wasn't gratitude or obligation or pity. It was something simpler and more complicated all at once, the beginning of hope. He drove home that night with the radio off, letting the quiet settle around him like a blanket. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like he was returning to a mausoleum of what he had lost. He felt like he was heading back to a life that might be worth rebuilding. And though he couldn't yet say it aloud, he knew in his bones that everything was about to change in ways he couldn't have planned for if he tried. On the morning that marked exactly 1 year since he had first sat alone on the park bench with the unlit candle and the little white box, Ryan woke before dawn. The sky outside his bedroom window was still indigo, the buildings along the river just dark shapes against the slow brightening horizon. He lay there for a long time listening to the quiet, feeling the unhurried, unfamiliar weight of peace in his chest. There had been so many mornings when he woke with dread pooling like lead in his stomach, when he braced himself for another day spent pretending he was whole. But this morning was different. He knew it even before he moved, before he dressed in the soft light and picked up the small box he had prepared the night before. He didn't go to the office that day. He didn't check his phone for messages from the board or emails that could have waited. Instead, he drove to the little diner that had become as familiar to him as his own kitchen, feeling the same quiet certainty he had felt the first time he stepped through its door. The neon sign over the window was still dark when he arrived. And for a moment he sat in the car, watching the dawn spill into the street and touched the windows with gold. He thought about how much had changed in a year, not only in the details of his life, but in the way he saw himself. It was almost impossible to believe there had been a time when he thought the only way to honor his daughter's memory was to lock it away where no one could reach it. When he finally climbed the steps and pushed the door open, he found Sarah already inside, tying her apron behind the counter. She looked up and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't feel like a question anymore. They had stopped pretending they were strangers months ago. There was a small vase of fresh daisies at the end of the counter, and he realized she must have put them out for today. For him, for Lily. That gesture, so quiet and so gentle, settled something in his chest that he hadn't even realized was still restless. "Morning," she said softly, and he crossed the floor to press a kiss to her cheek, something that still felt tender and extraordinary every time. Before he could answer, there was the unmistakable sound of small feet thumping across the kitchen tiles. And then Emma appeared, her hair a sleepy halo around her face. She was wearing a red dress that looked a little too short, the same one she'd worn the first day they met. And when she saw him, she ran forward without hesitation and wrapped her arms around his waist. He laughed and bent down to hug her properly, breathing in the simple sweetness of her shampoo and the warmth of her trust. "Are we going to the park today?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. He nodded, feeling the old ache twist behind his ribs, softer now than it used to be. "Yes," he said. "I thought we could take the cake there together." Sarah came around the counter, her hand settling lightly on Emma's back, and for a moment, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew what this day meant. Later, as they walked down the sidewalk with the cake carefully balanced in Emma's hands, Ryan felt a quiet astonishment that this was his life now, that he had allowed himself to step back into the world of ordinary things, cakes, and birthdays, and simple, unhurried mornings, and that it hadn't broken him, it had healed him. When they reached the same worn wooden bench in the little park, he sat down while Emma climbed onto the seat beside him, and Sarah remained standing, watching them both with an expression that he had come to understand was her way of holding hope and caution in the same breath. He took the box from Emma and lifted the lid, revealing a simple vanilla cake with 2 small candles, one for Lily and one for the year that had brought him here. Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a box of matches with the same solemnity she had shown a year ago. "Do you want me to light them?" she asked. He looked at her and felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded. She struck the match and held it steady, her face bright with concentration as she touched the flame to each wick. When both candles were burning, she climbed into his lap and rested her head on his shoulder as if she had always belonged there. Sarah came to sit beside them, her hand slipping into his without needing an explanation. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just this small circle of warmth and memory and love, and he felt the quiet conviction that Lily was part of it, too. Not gone, not really, just woven into everything good that remained. He closed his eyes and made a wish he didn't say aloud, because for the first time in years, he didn't need to. He knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be alone. When he opened his eyes again, Sarah was watching him with the same steady calm that had anchored him through the last few months. And Emma was smiling. In that way, children smile when they know something important has happened, even if they can't name it. He took a long breath and blew out the candles. The thin curl of smoke lifted into the bright morning air, and he felt something ease in his chest, something that had been locked away for far too long. They sat together for a long time after that, sharing the cake and the quiet unremarkable miracle of being exactly where they were meant to be. And for the first time since the day he lost everything, Ryan didn't feel like he was marking an end. He felt like he was celebrating a beginning. From Millionaire in Love.